Let's start with a simple example. If it's raining, the user should wear a raincoat and rain boots. What would that code look like? First, on line 3, we create the variable to store today's weather. If we were actually developing this for real users to use, we would probably get this from somewhere else, but for testing, we would create it manually to see if the rest of our code works. Next, on line 6, we use the relational operator for equality, the double equals, to check whether or not today's weather equals the string raining. If it does, we execute the code indented under that if statement. Here, the value of today's weather is in fact raining, and so it's true that today's weather equals raining. Because the if statement is true, the lines of code indented under it do run. And so our code runs line 8 and prints raincoat, and it runs line 10 and prints rain boots. The code after is not indented under that if statement, and so it runs regardless. And so the code ends by printing done. But what would happen if today's weather wasn't raining? Here we have the exact same code, except today's weather is now cold, not raining. Now we might know that cold and raining are pretty similar, but our code has no way of knowing that. As far as it can tell, cold just isn't the same as raining. So our code runs the same way until it gets to line 6. It checks to see if today's weather equals raining, but this time it doesn't. So this if statement is false. The indented lines of code only run if that if statement is true, but it was false. So what happens? The code just skips those lines. I'll start to use blue to indicate lines that are skipped. The lines of code that were indented underneath the false if statement are never run. As a result, we don't see raincoat or rain boots in our output because the lines of code that print raincoat and rain boots are never run. We do, however, see the word done get printed because done was not indented underneath the if statement. This print statement runs either way. What's particularly important to note here is the syntax of that if statement. We start with the word if. It's bold and red because it's a reserved word that Python attaches a special meaning to, and it's followed by a space. You might sometimes also see it followed by a parentheses, which is fine as long as you open and close the parentheses, but I prefer to use a space. The if keyword is always followed by a logical expression, an expression that will evaluate to either true or false. In this one, it's very easy. It just checks if a single variable has a single value, but it could be complex. It could have a lot of ands and ors and nots. It could involve different operators. It could actually involve mathematical operations right there within the if statement. It could get pretty complicated. The important thing, though, is it just has to evaluate to either true or false. And an if statement always concludes with a colon. A colon in Python is our universal character that tells Python there's going to be an indented code block immediately following that line of code. In fact, if we don't indent the next lines of code, Python actually gives us an error. So, when you're writing if statements or when you're writing conditionals, make sure you have all these pieces. The keyword if, followed by a space or a parentheses, followed by a logical expression of some sort, followed by a colon, and then on the next line, start an indented code block. That indented code block tells Python which lines of code are controlled by that if statement.